Imagine a machine composed of over 300,000 individual parts. It weighs 36,000 pounds. It requires over 360,000 hand-driven rivets to hold its aluminum skin together. Now, imagine building one of these massive machines from scratch every 63 minutes. During World War II, military experts, aviation executives, and the press all said it was mathematically and physically impossible. But Henry Ford and the raw industrial muscle of Detroit didn't listen. They built a 3.5 million square foot megastructure, bent it into an L shape just to dodge local taxes, and unleashed the greatest manufacturing miracle in human history. This is the forgotten story of Willow Run. Before we step inside the world's largest factory, make sure you hit that subscribe button. We tell the forgotten stories of World War II engineering. And you won't want to miss what we are building next. Now, let's go back to 1940. To understand the sheer insanity of what Ford accomplished, you have to understand how desperate the Allies were. While the German war machine was blitzing across Europe, the United States military was practically asleep. When Hitler invaded Poland, the U.S. Army Air Corps had fewer than 800 combat-ready aircraft. Most of them were obsolete. In May of 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and demanded the unthinkable. The United States needed to produce 50,000 planes a year. The American aviation industry literally laughed out loud. At the time, aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Consolidated Aircraft were building planes like bespoke, tailored suits. A team of master craftsmen would surround a single chassis, fitting parts by hand, filing down metal until it fit perfectly. It took weeks just to build one. See, they told the president that mass production of heavy bombers was a fantasy. The tolerances were too tight. The aluminum was too fragile. But FDR knew something the aviation experts didn't. He knew that if you wanted to build 50,000 of anything a year, you didn't ask airplane builders, you asked car builders. You called Detroit. The military approached the Ford Motor Company with the consolidated B-24 Liberator, a massive, complex, heavy bomber. But why the B-24? And the American public was already in love with the famous B-17 Flying Fortress. But the military generals knew the B-17 didn't have the range to win a global war. The B-24 Liberator featured the highly classified Davis wing, a narrow, highly advanced airfoil that allowed the massive plane to fly faster, farther, and carry a much heavier payload than the B-17. It could cross the Atlantic Ocean and strike the vital Axis oil fields deep in Romania. But that advanced wing made it notoriously difficult to fly, and even harder to build. It was an awkward, slab-sided beast. Pilots called it the flying boxcar. The generals knew that if they could mass-produce this specific ugly duckling, they could bomb the Axis powers into submission. Ford sent his production genius, Charles Sorensen, out to the Consolidated factory in San Diego to see how they built them. What Sorensen saw disgusted him. He watched highly skilled men wasting days trying to custom-fit parts. That night, in his hotel room, Sorensen took out a piece of paper and sketched out an assembly line a mile long. He promised the government that Ford would build a factory so massive it would spit out heavy bombers like Model Ts. But Detroit arrogance was about to hit a brick wall, because as Henry Ford was about to find out, an airplane is not a car. And his arrogant promise was about to trigger one of the most humiliating, disastrous, and deadly industrial failures in American history. To build a bomber on an assembly line, Ford needed a factory unlike anything the world had ever seen. In early 1941, Ford purchased a massive plot of farmland and forest in Ypsilanti, Michigan. The site was named Willow Run. They hired the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, to design the facility. The scale was staggering. The main building alone would cover over 3.5 million square feet. That is roughly equivalent to 82 football fields, all under one continuous roof. It was the largest enclosed room in the history of the world. But when you look at aerial photos of Willow Run, something immediately looks wrong. A mile-long assembly line needs to be perfectly straight for maximum efficiency. Yet, right at the end of the building, the massive factory takes a sharp, awkward 90-degree turn, forming a giant L shape. Aviation engineers thought it was a design flaw, but it wasn't a mistake. It was a monument to Henry Ford's absolute, unapologetic pettiness. If Kahn had built the factory in a straight line, the end of the assembly line would have crossed the county border into Wayne County. Henry Ford absolutely despised Wayne County. It was the heart of the heavily unionized auto industry, and it carried massive property taxes. Ford famously declared he would never build another factory there. So, he forced his architect to literally bend a mile-long, multi-million-dollar military megastructure just to keep the entire building inside Washtenaw County. He compromised the efficiency of the world's most important war factory just to avoid paying Wayne County taxes. By late 1941, the massive steel skeleton was complete. Ford had built the machine that builds the machine. Now, it was time to prove the aviation experts wrong. Charles Sorensen and Edsel Ford initiated the mile-long assembly line, preparing to flood the sky with Liberators. But instead of a manufacturing miracle, they created an absolute nightmare. The experts had been right. Ford's auto workers were used to banging steel into shape with heavy mallets. But the B-24 was made of thin, delicate aluminum. When Ford's heavy automotive presses slammed down on the aircraft metal, it didn't shape it, and it shattered it. The assembly line ground to a halt. Months went by, and while American boys were fighting and dying overseas, the largest factory on Earth had produced absolutely nothing. The national press turned vicious. They stopped calling the plant Willow Run and began publishing mocking headlines that asked a terrifying question. Will it run? The failure wasn't just about smashing aluminum. It was a massive clash of two completely different engineering cultures. To an aviation engineer in 1941, a blueprint was just a suggestion. Since planes were built by hand, if a part didn't fit, a master mechanic simply filed it down until it did. But to a Detroit auto engineer, a blueprint is absolute law. An assembly line does not allow for filing things down. A part must be machined to a tolerance of 1/1000th of an inch, so that it fits perfectly every single time on every single plane, as the line moves continuously forward. When Ford's team received the blueprints for the B-24 Liberator from Consolidated Aircraft, they were horrified. Nothing matched up. To make the plane mass-producible, Ford engineers had to completely redraw over 30,000 individual blueprints. As the delays mounted, Henry Ford grew paranoid. To help fix the disaster, he brought in a wild card, Charles Lindbergh. The most famous aviator in the world, the man who had first crossed the Atlantic, was hired as a secret consultant. Lindbergh walked the floor of Willow Run and actually test flew the early, deeply flawed B-24s coming off the line. Lindbergh was appalled by the lack of aviation experience in the plant. He constantly clashed with Ford's auto executives, warning them that if an engine fails on a car, you simply pull over. But if an engine fails on a heavy bomber, 10 young men fall from the sky. Lindbergh's intense demands for quality control infuriated the Detroit automen, creating a toxic, high-stakes civil war inside the plant's management. And just when they would finally get the tooling right, the military would change its mind. Based on brutal combat reports coming in from Europe, The Army Air Forces constantly demanded modifications. Thicker armor, heavier machine guns, different turrets. Every change brought the mile-long assembly line to a screeching halt. By mid-1942, Willow Run was a national embarrassment. The plant was supposed to be producing hundreds of bombers a month. Instead, they were pushing out a handful. A special Senate committee, led by future President Harry Truman, launched a ruthless investigation. The United States government actually threatened to seize control of the plant and rip it out of Henry Ford's hands. The pressure was unimaginable, and it fell squarely onto the shoulders of one man, Edsel Ford, Henry Ford's only son and the president of the Ford Motor Company. While Henry was becoming increasingly erratic, firing top engineers and fighting with Lindbergh and the government, Edsel was working himself to death trying to make the Willow Run miracle happen. Edsel spent endless days and sleepless nights at the plant, absorbing the political attacks, calming the furious generals, and trying to shield his engineers from his father's wrath. The stress was absolute. It devastated his immune system and destroyed his body. In May of 1943, at the very height of the Willow Run crisis, Edsel Ford died of stomach cancer at the age of 49. The mastermind behind the Willow Run project was gone. The press had written the factory off as a billion-dollar blunder, but deep inside the colossal 3.5 million square foot facility, Charles Sorensen and Edsel's grieving engineers had finally cracked the code. They had built massive, permanent steel dies that could stamp airplane parts perfectly without shattering them, and the blueprints were locked in. The assembly line was finally, brutally, ready to move. The Axis powers were about to find out what happens when you wake the sleeping giant of Detroit. The machines were finally ready, but Ford faced a brand new crisis: a massive labor shortage. Most of Detroit's able-bodied men had already shipped out to fight overseas. To run the largest factory on Earth, Ford had to do something unprecedented. They hired women, tens of thousands of them. Why nicknamed Rosie the Riveters, this new army of female workers took over the cavernous factory floor. They manned the deafening stamping presses, they climbed inside the cramped bomber fuselages with rivet guns, and they wired the complex electrical systems. Among these tens of thousands of women was a young widow from Kentucky named Rose Will Monroe. She had moved to Michigan to build bombers for the war effort. While she was working on the Willow Run assembly line, to driving rivets into the aluminum skin of a B-24, Hollywood actor Walter Pidgeon happened to be touring the massive factory to shoot a promotional film for war bonds. He was looking for someone to represent the millions of women working in factories across America. By pure coincidence, he found a literal riveter named Rose. She was cast in a nationwide film campaign, officially bringing the legendary Rosie the Riveter character to life on the silver screen. Rose Will Monroe became a national icon, symbolizing the raw, unstoppable grit of the women who were keeping the arsenal of democracy alive. But this massive workforce created a terrifying logistical nightmare. Where do you put 40,000 workers in a rural farmland? Ypsilanti was a small town. People were sleeping in cars, barns, and tents in the freezing Michigan winter just to work at the plant. Ford and the government had to construct an instant city overnight. They built Willow Lodge, a massive, sprawling temporary metropolis that locals called Bomber City. It had its own police force, its own fire department, movie theaters, and cafeterias operating 24 hours a day to feed the shift workers. It was a chaotic boomtown. Disease outbreaks, racial tensions, and brutal weather threatened to tear Bomber City apart. But the workers held the line. With them at the helm, the beast finally woke up. In late 1943, the mile-long assembly line began to continuously crawl. And at one end, raw sheets of aluminum, spools of wire, and massive Pratt and Whitney engines went in. At the other end, massive hangar doors opened up, and a fully armed, fully functional B-24 Liberator rolled straight out onto the tarmac. The speed was terrifying. The aviation experts who had laughed at Henry Ford were suddenly watching in stunned silence. By 1944, Willow Run wasn't just working. It was breaking the laws of physics and manufacturing. They hit their absolute peak production speed. They were completing a 36,000-pound, four-engine heavy bomber every 63 minutes. That is nearly one plane an hour. A machine of war so complex it used to take weeks to build by hand, now rolling out the door faster than it takes to eat lunch. But there was a grim, heartbreaking reason the military desperately needed a new bomber every 63 minutes. The skies over Europe were a meat grinder. The B-24 Liberators were being sent on some of the most dangerous and suicidal missions of the entire war. Nothing exemplifies this brutal reality more than Operation Tidal Wave in August of 1943. The Allies needed to choke off Adolf Hitler's oil supply, which was concentrated in the heavily defended refineries of Ploiești, Romania. The B-24 Liberator was the only bomber in the world with the massive range required to reach Romania from bases in North Africa. But to avoid German radar, the commanding generals ordered the bombers to attack at treetop level. Over 170 Liberators flew into a literal wall of anti-aircraft fire, barrage balloons, and exploding oil tanks. Pilots were flying these massive 36,000-pound machines just 50 feet off the ground, dodging church steeples and smokestacks. The B-24 proved it could take catastrophic damage and still fly. But the cost was absolutely devastating. 53 aircraft were lost in that single mission. Over 600 American airmen were killed or captured in a matter of hours, and 5 Medals of Honor were awarded, the most ever given for a single air action in American history. The sheer attrition rate of the air war meant that every time Willow Run pushed a new bomber out of its hangar doors, it was immediately replacing one that had been shot to pieces over Axis territory. The 63-minute miracle wasn't just a production record, it was a desperate race against death. In total, the Willow Run plant produced exactly half of all the B-24 Liberators used by the United States in World War II. Over 8,600 planes. They overwhelmed the Luftwaffe not just with technology, but with sheer, unstoppable industrial violence. But what happens to the largest building in the history of the world when the war finally ends? You can't just hide a 3.5 million square foot megastructure. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Willow Run assembly line shut down almost overnight. The massive factory went eerily quiet. For a few years, it was leased to the Kaiser Frazer Corporation to build civilian automobiles. But in 1953, Willow Run would once again step up to save American industry. In August of 1953, General Motors suffered the worst industrial fire in American history when its massive transmission plant in Livonia, Michigan, completely burned to the ground. Millions of square feet of steel literally melted. GM was paralyzed. Without transmissions, they couldn't build cars. Facing absolute financial ruin, GM frantically leased the massive, empty Willow Run facility. In a matter of weeks, they moved thousands of machines into Henry Ford's old bomber plant and restarted production, saving the company from collapse. GM eventually bought the plant entirely, and for the next 60 years, the factory that once built bombers to crush the Axis powers quietly built transmissions for Chevrolet trucks and family sedans. While the massive L-shaped building was finally demolished in 2014, its legacy remains untouchable. Henry Ford's L-shaped megastructure had a disastrous start, a devastating human cost, and a petty, tax-dodging design. But in the end, it proved that when the Allies desperately needed an arsenal of democracy, Detroit could build the impossible.